Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. Two stories that touch two important areas of many people's lives dominate the programme today: health and education. Over the past week, we've seen details of the £200 million plan to tackle waiting lists. Now there's a call from our universities for Stormont to raise tuition fees. I'll be hearing from the Deputy Chair of the BMA and a member of the Assembly's Health Committee about the opportunities and the concerns around Mike Nesbitt's plan. And the week ahead should see more reaction to that big move from the universities. Will our politicians agree to the call for fees to rise by around £1,000 a year? And here with his thoughts on what we're discussing, the Press Association's Ireland editor, David Young. Next month, we'll see the first move in the big push to reduce waiting lists. Patients who've been waiting more than 2 years for an operation can pay for it in the Republic and then claim the money back. It was one of the headline measures announced by the Health Minister during the week, part of an overall £215 million push to tackle the waiting list millstone that's been hanging around the neck of Stormont and the health service here for years. I'll be hearing from Dr. Clodagh Corrigan, Deputy Chair of the British Medical Association here, and the Alliance MLA, Nuala McAllister, in a moment. But first, here's the Minister, Mike Nesbitt, speaking in the Assembly on Tuesday.
Far too many patients are waiting far too long for assessment and for treatment, and that's right across Northern Ireland. Our waiting lists are truly appalling. We will invest across three areas. 1, red flag and time-critical services. 2, capacity building. And 3, backlog clearance. No hospital is going to be closing on my watch. We need every square yard, every square metre of available HSC space.
We did ask Mike Nesbitt to take part in the programme, by the way, but we were told he was unavailable. Dr. Clodagh Corrigan and Nuala McAllister are here, however, and welcome to both of you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Dr. Corrigan, first of all, the Minister's acknowledged the lack of equity in what he announced, but is it just a case of we are where we are and we have to get on with it?
So we are in a dire situation. Our waiting lists are extensive. They're the worst waiting lists in the entire UK. That said, we know that there is an enormous gap in health access and in poverty in Northern Ireland. The average life expectancy for those who are the most well off and the least well off varies by just over 7 years. So if we're now in a position where we are providing a better health service and better access to health for those who can afford it, we're going to see that disparity become even greater, and people who can't afford to pay for their healthcare up front really suffering and doing much poorer outcomes.
And there are, Nuala McAllister, so many issues here, and we'll get into some of the detail in a moment or two, but is one way of characterising the situation we're in to say that the Minister's plan is effectively the least worst option?
I mean, to be fair to the Minister, I think he has to do something, and this is the first step. You know, there are many MLAs across all parties who called for the reopening of the reimbursement scheme. However, we are now long into the phase of a two-tier health system in Northern Ireland, one where if you can afford to go private, then you will go private. The Minister did say that there may be changes, but a question that we want to know is what's the criteria for these 2-year waits? Are we talking about 2-year waits that will actually take the pressure off the longest waits in the health service themselves? There does have to be, it is an unequal service, but there has to be some equity in it if it's going to actually relieve the pressure elsewhere. If it's not going to relieve the pressure, then we need to look again at other options. You know, there's a sector here in Northern Ireland that have said they're willing to step up. Unfortunately, it's another independent and private sector, but we need to use all levers, and that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, and Mike Nesbitt, to be fair to him, did say he's giving people a heads up of what his thinking is and what his planning is, but there's going to be an awful lot more detail coming into the public domain in the weeks ahead, and we'll all be looking out for that. But you've got financial concerns, Clodagh Corrigan, first of all. The majority of the money being used here, of course, isn't new. The Minister's been very upfront about that. And he did warn in his speech about the consequences of this money being channelled into waiting lists, because if it's going to be spent on that, it can't be spent on something else.
Yes, absolutely. We're already in a situation in our health service where we're being propped up by staff goodwill, by and large, and taking money out of the day-to-day spending and reducing our access to services and even just to things that we need, the material items that we need, the money has to be saved from somewhere. So what are we going to lose? And what services are we going to have to cut? How much worse is the care that we're providing our patients on a day-to-day basis going to have to get to fund this £165 million savings that the Minister is looking for to invest in the waiting lists?
Yeah. Does that feature as a major concern of yours as well, that there are going to have to be compromises and trade-offs if this is going to work?
I mean, there will be, but this is why, since the Assembly was re-established and since Mike Nesbitt came on board as Health Minister, we have asked him, what are your priorities? So when you look at a Health Minister and previous Health Ministers who have failed to actually prioritise areas of need and invest in those areas to offset the balance elsewhere, then we wouldn't be in this situation. But unfortunately, that's where the Executive has come to. It's people want to see waiting lists reduced. This is one of the measures to take on that. But if we are going to actually make savings, then we need a plan with detail from the Health Department and its leader that will actually see that happen. We hear about this shift left. The Minister wants to shift left. Well then, in order to do that, we need to invest and prioritise our primary care services, for example. Whenever GPs are only given 5% of the health budget, but actually they take care of a lot of the patients across Northern Ireland. We also need to prioritise health inequalities in Northern Ireland. But we're hearing words, we're just not seeing action of where those priorities lie. Now, it's right and proper that the Minister will tackle red flags, for example. It's right and proper that people will get seen on a basis in which they need to actually have better outcomes. But we are not seeing the better outcomes on the whole, despite the hard efforts from all of the staff right across Northern Ireland, regardless of whether you're in the Western Trust or the Belfast Trust. There isn't a staff within our health service that isn't actually putting in the effort.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, the Minister has made it very, very clear that waiting lists seem to be a priority for the public. He sees them as a priority. Transformation is obviously key. He's put in those he's rolling out his scheme to put in those multidisciplinary teams into primary care as well. So he would say, I think he's got to make very difficult decisions. And I mean, it is also the case, for example, that non-surgical patients who can be on very long waiting lists aren't included in this particular development. I mean, that's a difficult decision, not what the Minister would want, but he has to be realistic within the resources that he's got.
Yes, we do have to be realistic, but we're not working within the resources we've got. You know, we're working within this ever-expanding need, and we need more and more and more just to stay afloat. So we can't, with the resources we've got, we can't maintain where we currently are. We need more investment, and that's what we're grossly lacking, is the new funding. And like Nuala said, we need that leftward shift into primary care. Our GP colleagues see 1 in 10 of our population every single week. That's not sustainable. We need that money to be invested well and invested in what's going to make the difference at prevention level, as well as trying to tackle where we've already fallen down.
Can I also ask you about transformation? Because we've just touched on that very briefly up to this point. It is a huge issue, of course, Dr. Corrigan. And last week, we had local campaigners in Fermanagh demanding the return of emergency surgery to the SWA, and many local politicians appear to back that call. What do you make of that situation?
So we do need transformation in our services. We are in a situation where we don't have enough healthcare providers for the number of hospitals that we have around the province. That said, we also don't have the infrastructure. So transformation needs to be a very much cross-executive view. There needs to be that vision and oversight from all of the parties and all of the different departments of the executive. But we need a multi-year budget, and we need it planned and delivered in a controlled manner. What we're seeing at the moment is collapse of services. We've seen collapse of emergency surgery across the SWA in Daisy Hill. We've seen numerous GP services where they've had to hand back their contracts because they can't manage any further. That's not transformation, and that's not what we want to see. Yeah. It's not good for patients. We need planning. And you know about that from personal experience because you work on the front line in Daisy Hill as well, of course. Nuala McAllister, let me just ask you about that. I mean, the argument here is that
the campaigners want emergency surgery to return to SWA as soon as possible. That is not the plan, and the Minister has made it very clear he thinks the focus needs to be on an increase in elective surgery. Use every available square foot within health and social care for elective surgery to help drive down those waiting lists as well. Can you see the logic in that, and is your party comfortable with that?
No, look, absolutely. We have said that we will support transformation, provided we're not talking about transformation through service collapse, and I think they are two very different things. But at the heart of that is about workforce planning as well. If you cannot get the surgical consultants to be available and able to actually work in certain hospitals and actually target that, to drive that there, you're not going to change the situation. However, if you do increase elective care using every square footage of all theatre space in Northern Ireland, you need to talk to the people on the ground who are actually delivering that to ensure that that can be done in the most productive way. I know that this
presumably
time...
the department, presumably the Minister would say that is exactly what they've been doing.
I was on this show less than a year ago with you, Mark, in which that wasn't happening, and we challenged the Minister on that, and you had a representative from the Royal College of Surgeons to say that we needed more engagement. So,
well, is there any indication that you've got that that's improved over the last 12 months?
Slightly, yes, it has improved slightly, however, caveated with the point that actually the follow-through and the actions, they're not there. So I'm reluctant to say it's nothing has changed, because I am putting faith in the Minister that he will actually do a good job here. But I will also hold the Minister and the department to account on these actions, because we need to see better outcomes.
Here's the question, I suppose. We need to land this conversation, and it is that it's a question really as to whether or not politicians are really committed to transformation. When you see on the ground local politicians supporting the status quo, or wanting a return to what used to be the status quo, I suppose, and not agreeing with the Minister. So, for example, we had your Alliance colleague, Eddie Roof, supporting the campaigners down in the SWA, as I understand it. Is it party policy to support the return of emergency surgery?
So my colleague Eddie was supporting the fact that we shouldn't have transformation through collapse of services. So, and we need to be correct here, because Alliance were the only party, for example, when we had true transformation out of hours at the Ulster Hospital, when it came to the urgent care services, Alliance were the only party to actually stand up and support that. Even the Minister's own party didn't do so. And we held the ground, and we got some public kickback, but actually, you know, it was worth it in the end. It had better outcomes. We are seeing an improvement in that area. So what my colleagues say across the board, and that is party policy, is that we need to have proper planning. We can't have service collapse. That's not transformation. But we do support transformation. We have said to the department themselves, we've said to officials when they come to the Health Committee that we are willing to support it, provided there is a plan in place. And look, there are experts on the ground. There are experts like Clodagh, there are experts in many of the Royal Colleges that do have actual ideas that can put this into action. Let
me just ask Dr. Corrigan finally, are you reassured by that? I mean, do you think that the politicians have got a proper understanding of this? Because it is very complicated, and you can imagine people at home watching this not fully understanding where people necessarily stand on what is for them a key issue.
I think for the politicians it's quite difficult. You know, they are obviously running from assembly to assembly, and they have to maintain their public support. But what we don't have is the vision of where our health service is going to be, and where our assembly wants the health service to be in the next 5-10 years. And that's what is key. OK, really interesting conversation. Thanks both very much indeed. And we'll get more detail from the Minister in the next few weeks. And I'm assuming that you'll be very keen to comment on that when the time comes. But for now, thanks both very much indeed. Let's hear from today's commentator, David Young, who's been listening very carefully to what's just been said. I mean, it's complicated because on the one hand, Mike Nesbitt has said many times decisions made from very different starting points need to be made. He says there will be consequences when he makes those decisions, as we've been discussing for other parts of the health service. But this is what the executive was urged to do over the past year: make difficult decisions.
Yeah, and I suppose for the Minister, you know, the balancing act he has to perform in this is, yes, prioritising the waiting lists, which are horrendous by anyone's standards. And we heard in the Assembly last week, people in the Western Trust waiting 9 years for standard hip replacement surgery. So he has to tackle those, try and address the waiting list, but still continue the momentum with transformation, because that's the important point here. Because you can do all you want with waiting lists and work year after year after year to get them down, but if you haven't changed the system which created them in the first place, then you sort of go back to square one and the waiting lists go back up again. So it's that balancing act between doing prioritising the waiting lists, focusing on transformation, all within a constrained budget. And that's the challenge the Minister has at the moment.
Yeah, and what about the agitation, let's say, of local politicians on the ground who are concerned about the removal of certain services? But we've heard that clarification there from Nuala McAllister about the issue of collapse of services, which is helps people maybe to understand the complexity of what we're discussing here.
Well, that transformation piece is predicated, and is, the main part of it is on reconfiguration. Now, that's obviously going to create a lot of. There's going to be a lot of difficult decisions have to be taken. We've heard about the situation with SWA, with Daisy Hill. There's similar situations around Causeway. So it's whether the Minister can secure that political buy-in. I think, we may have differential between what the reaction is locally from politicians, but I think from the Minister's point of view, it's crucial that he has it around the executive table, because that's when the decisions are going to have to be made, and that's where he has to secure the support in order to drive those changes forward.
Okay. David, for now, thanks very much indeed. We'll hear again from you after this next story, which is about the move by universities to call on party leaders to back a rise in tuition fees here. The universities haven't put an exact figure on the uplift they want to see, but a notional rise of over £1,000 a year has been floated, and that would potentially bring fees from just over £4,700 a year to just over £5,800. Here's our education correspondent, Robbie Meredith.
These sixth formers at Belfast Girls Model face exams soon, but they're already looking ahead to university and how to pay for it.
At the minute, having a part-time job, I believe like a lot of my peers and people my age, start to save, maybe whether it's saving for university or saving for things in the future.
I'm also having to look at living expenses and utilities and food and travel back and forth if I want to come home.
There's so much information about particular courses that they can choose. However, the stark reality is that often the options are very limited because it's based purely on finances.
Universities here are funded in two basic ways, directly from Stormont and then from students through tuition fees. The level of fees is set by the executive too. They're lower here than England and Wales, but university leaders say they haven't kept pace with inflation. In their letter to political leaders, the universities said that funding is not sustainable and that tuition fee increases have consistently fallen below inflation. They suggest fees rise from the current £4,750 a year to £5,831 a year.
I think Northern Ireland, I've seen it with my own eyes, like there's communities and estates that struggle to put food on their table, never mind paying more to go to university, and I think the tuition will put a lot of people off. It's a lot of money.
Students take on a loan to cover their fees and living costs, which they pay back when they start working, but that can mean significant debt.
If the costs are increasing, then obviously you're going to need to pay it out longer, even longer.
Education is seen as a burden to the budget at the moment, but it needs to be seen as an investment for our future and our young people.
It's now up to politicians, but 5 years ago, the First Minister wasn't keen.
I don't think that any conversation around raising tuition fees is a helpful conversation. It's also not the right approach. We should be opening access to education, not breaking it down.
The executive she leads will decide if that has changed.
Robbie Meredith reporting there. David Young is still with us, and we've been joined by Stephen Kelly, who's both Chief Executive of Manufacturing NI and Chair of the Ulster University Magee Task Force, which was set up to develop an action plan for expanding Ulster University's London Derry campus. So welcome again to both of you. David, just first of all, Press Association, of course, published the contents of the letter that the universities sent towards the end of the week. Effectively, what they're saying is their finances are on a sticky wicket and they're putting it up to the politicians to do something about it.
Indeed, and I think it's important the way they couched it as well, because they're not essentially characterising this as a policy change. They're not asking for a policy change from the executive. There are different models across the UK. Scotland, the Scottish Government pays essentially everything, so students and Scottish students don't pay fees. In England, they put the onus very much on the universities to raise their funds through tuition fees. In Northern Ireland, it's sort of a halfway house, a lot of money from the executive, but also money raised by student fees. So I think it was important from the university's point of view that they couched this as not a policy change, but essentially the implementation of the policy as it should be. And that is specifically in regard to inflationary uplifts. They say that since 2011, the fees have not gone up as they should have done in terms of inflations, whereas their costs have gone up with inflation. Obviously, in the recent years, inflation has been a massive pressure for them. Costs have soared, but you see these incremental rises in tuition fees. And what they're asking for is that the fees, as they are now, to be adjusted in line with inflation. So I think from their point of view, that doesn't put as much maybe political pressure on the parties at Stormont to back a policy change.
Yeah, I mean, the question is precisely where the politicians at Stormont stand on this. This is a challenge to them, and I'm going to come to Stephen just a second. The question is, what will the politicians do? We've had a bit of reaction, but it's not absolutely clear yet.
Well, no, and at the end of the day, this is a political decision because Stormont also contributes to higher education. They contribute a lot of money. They're reducing those fees. That contribution has reduced over recent years as well. So essentially, they could sustain funding for higher education by increasing Stormont's funding. So it doesn't have to be necessarily borne by students in this. Stormont and politicians around the executive table have a decision to make, and they could bear that cost themselves.
OK. Stephen Kelly, you're right at the heart of this debate as far as the Northwest is concerned. Let me just ask you, first of all, if fees were increased along the lines of what the universities are calling for, do you think that would help get increased numbers into Magee?
Well, we put a challenge to the Minister back last year before we published our action plan and asked the Minister to make a choice whether this was about just maintaining student numbers as they currently were, or actually providing an opportunity for those 5,000 young people who leave Northern Ireland every year to go to universities across the water. The choice was to have more young people studying here at home. That comes at a cost. That comes at a financial burden currently shared between the executive and the student population themselves. So any money that actually brings parity back in terms of how universities are funded here versus how they're funded in GB obviously puts more money in the system, makes it easier for the executive to ensure that we have spaces here locally for those young people to study. And included in that will obviously be the expansion of Magee.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Arlene Foster suggested fees should rise when Stormont returned from its last but one suspension back in 2020. Michelle O'Neill at that time knocked it back. Now, as we've heard with health earlier in this programme, we're getting to the point where decisions as unpalatable, distasteful as they might be for some, are going to have to be made. It's as simple as that.
Well, it is. I mean, in this debate and the second half of your programme very much relates to the first half of the programme as well. We need a sustainable workforce in our hospitals and in our healthcare system. That's been provided by our universities. Just here in Derry, in terms of the Magee campus, the Western Trust, for the first time, and the First Trust has a sustainable workforce in nursing, but there's also radiographers, there's physiotherapists, and a whole raft of other skills that are being developed by those universities for our health services. So if we want a healthy economy, if we want a wealthy economy, then we need to ensure that we have our universities properly funded.
Yeah, so it's not just about health and social care, because wearing your business hat as Chief Executive of Manufacturing NI, you're saying, are you effectively, it is the case that the more graduates we produce, potentially, the better our economic performance will be. Can you make that connection?
Absolutely. We've too many young people leaving Northern Ireland to travel across to England, Scotland and Wales, and who never return. Those are people that are lost to this economy. If you look at the demographics of the population in Northern Ireland, we have a peak in terms of that university going age back out in 2029. We need to make sure those people are retained here in Northern Ireland to contribute, not just in terms of our economy, but across all our public services as well.
Do you think this is a very persuasive argument that the universities have put forward? Because you're not speaking on behalf of the universities today, but you are, let's just describe you as university adjacent. But, you know, when the universities were given an opportunity to come on and talk about this, they didn't want to at this stage for whatever reason. If it's a strong case, would you not want to be out there making it?
Well, I think they should be. You heard it yourself from the representative of the Student Union in Robbie's piece a little earlier. This is an investment. This is an investment in our young people. This is an investment in our economy and other services as well. The universities play a vital role. We've actually provided an economic analysis about the growth at the Magee campus, what that would mean to the Northwest economy and the economy in Northern Ireland. And it's hundreds of millions of pounds for for that investment that comes through. This is a really good investment that the executive could make. The model we have here in Northern Ireland is a shared investment model. yes, no one likes to pay any taxes. I don't like to pay taxes. I'm sure your viewers don't either. But this is probably one of the most progressive taxes in that you only repay the student loan whenever you reach certain levels of income, and the more that you earn, the more that you pay back.
Can I just ask you very quickly, you go toe-to-toe with politicians on a range of issues all the time, so you're no shrinking violet. There might be some of them watching the programme today who might be guided by what you're saying. Some of the parties have come out on the front foot saying, look, absolutely not going to happen. We are opposed to this from a fundamental point of view. Have they got that wrong, and what do they need to do to understand it from your perspective and the perspective that most will benefit students in future?
Well, it's a simple choice. The choice is that either Stormont pay significantly more to provide a sustainable funding model for our two world-class universities and our colleges, or they share the burden along with those people in terms of the student population as well, who will repay that in the longer term. There has to be a choice made here. It's the same question that was raised earlier in the conversation. If we want to have a world-class health service, if we want to have a world-class education service, then someone needs to be providing that money.
Well, Stephen Kelly couldn't be clearer there. I think it's fair to say, David, in what he's just said. Why do you think, for example, and just to raise that question again very briefly, why do you think the universities haven't decided to come onto the front foot to explain? They send a letter, that's fine, we look at the letter, we can extrapolate what it is they're trying to say, but they're not putting people up to just say it themselves. Why not?
Yeah, and it is a difficult one because you're right, the top line news in this, it's open to misinterpretation. It's open to people getting maybe the wrong end of the stick from the universities, because it does seem on the face of it, it's quite counterintuitive to say we want to keep students in Northern Ireland, but we're raising the fees for those same students, so surely that would be a pressure to make them seek education elsewhere.
Yeah, but we just to clarify for people who may be not aware of the details, although the fees would go up by just over £1,000, they'd still be substantially less than the fees for universities across the water in England, Scotland and Wales.
And that's the point the universities, I think, need to make publicly, and also the point that they need to make as well is the fact that the consequences of not doing this is the big issue, and the consequences of that is the potential for student places in Northern Ireland for local students to be cut. And yes, politicians may react unfavourably to the prospect of fees going up, but how would they react to the prospect of universities coming out and announcing, the next academic term or the academic term one from now, we're going to have to reduce the number of places available to local students, and that's, something has to give somewhere in this.
Yeah, it's just very quickly, we've about 20 seconds. We've got 90 MLAs at Stormont, of whom a great deal is going to be demanded, and this does connect, as Stephen's just said, with our previous conversation, difficult decisions about education and about health.
And they're all interlinked because it's a skill-based economy that the executive want ultimately, and in order to do that you need students educated locally.
OK, got to leave it there, folks. Thanks both very much indeed. Lots more on that in the weeks and months ahead, no doubt, but that's all we've got time for today. I'll be back with The View on Thursday night at the usual time of 10:40 on BBC One and iPlayer, and do look out for the latest Red Lines podcast, which will drop this Wednesday afternoon. If you want to catch up on last Thursday's programme or any of our programmes and podcasts, you can now find all of them in one place. Just go to bbc.co.uk/newsni or the BBC News app and scroll down to find the programmes. For now, though, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.